Hello. In this video, we'll have a look at government buildings or state capitol buildings in United States and Canada. Those are the yellow pins. I've place marked them all basically here. And we'll focus in on the area around New England here. So I'm going to zoom in here. And now I'm going to add distances between these buildings. These ones. I'm going to show here that there is an order or pattern to these distances. And the pattern of order consists of when you compare this in pairs of distances, for example, between New York State Capitol to Rhode Island and New York to Connecticut State Capitol, you find that there is an order to the distances. And as I've shown in videos between cathedrals in Europe, in England specifically, there the distances between the cathedrals are ordered, for example, by the ratio between the kilometer and the mile. And I've shown that mountains in Europe and Asia, when you compare distances between them, are ordered by the same ratio, that between the kilometer and the mile. So we'll start here, and I'll show you that these government buildings here, you find exactly the same order between them when you compare distances. So this is the most recent category of buildings or objects on the surface of Earth, these government buildings in North America, where I can show that the same order determines the location of also these buildings or structures on the face of our planet. And I've also shown, just quickly, that ancient sites like Giza, the Giza Plateau, relates to mountains in exactly this same way when you measure distances from mountains to Giza. I've put out videos here on my channel that show all of this that I say here. But this focus now is on government buildings here in the United States and Canada with this little sample area in and around New England here. So let me click these distances away and begin with the first pair of distances. And that is here from New York State Capitol building to Rhode Island State House and Connecticut State Capitol. These two distances are in the ratio of 1 mile and 1 kilometer. So exactly the same numbers come up in miles and kilometers in these two distances. So let's start to measure from New York to Rhode Island and Connecticut. And first in kilometers to Connecticut State Capitol. Here is New York State Capitol, and we measure from here to Connecticut. And the distance we find here is 132.8 kilometers. 132.8. You can see it in the measure tool here. 132.8 kilometers. So let's fly back to New York and now measure in miles to Rhode Island State House, where we should find 132.8 miles. So let's see. So here we are at Rhode Island State House right here, and we see 132.8 miles right here. So 1 mile and 1 kilometer ordered those two distances. This is the first example, first pair. Now let's take the second pair. I click these away and add the second pair instead. And that is Rhode Island State House to Massachusetts State House and Connecticut State Capitol. And here again, we have exactly 1 kilometer in this distance and 1 mile in this distance. So let's measure, first in kilometers, the shorter distance there. Rhode Island to Massachusetts. And here we must measure the farthest distance we find in sort of the footprint of these buildings. So from this end of the State House up to Massachusetts. Massachusetts State House is here in Boston, and we find the longest distance to be 65.55 kilometers. 65.55. So let's look now in miles in the other distance and back to Rhode Island to measure to Connecticut. And here is Rhode Island State House again, and we'll measure the shortest distance we can find between these two buildings. So off to Connecticut. And here we're looking for 65.55 miles here. Here's Connecticut. And just when we reach the building here, we have 65.55 in miles. You can see it here in the measure tool. So again, the ratio between these two distances is as 1 kilometer and 1 mile between these buildings. So that was the second example. Let me take that away and add the next. And this time it's Massachusetts State House to Connecticut State Capitol, 1 kilometer, and Massachusetts to Maine State House, 1 mile. So let's measure from Massachusetts to those two, and first to Connecticut in kilometers. And here again is Massachusetts. We can measure from this end of the building down to Connecticut. And we find the distance here of, let's say, 149.25 in kilometers. You see it right here, 149.25. And that's what we'll find in miles in the next distance. So let's measure that. And back at Massachusetts, we attach the line here and measure up to Maine State House. So 149.25 miles. And here is Maine State House. And if you can look in the measure tool there, we have 149.25 in miles here in this distance. So again, the ratio between these two distances and these government buildings is again 1 kilometer here and 1 mile here. That was that example. Let me take that away and add the next. And this time it's these two distances. New Hampshire State House to New York State Capitol is 1 kilometer compared to this one. Maine State House up to New Brunswick Legislative Building in Canada, which is as 1 mile. So let's measure from first New Hampshire to New York, and then Maine to New Brunswick. And here in kilometers then, Maine to New York. We find a distance of 191.38 kilometers. Here is New York State Capitol. 191.38 kilometers here in the measure tool. Let's measure now in miles from Maine to New Brunswick, where we should find 191.38 miles here. So let's measure. Here is Maine State House and up to New Brunswick. 191, here is New Brunswick Legislative Building. 191.38 we have in miles here. You can see it in the measure tool. So again, we had the ratio between these two distances of 1 mile and 1 kilometers. Between these two here, 1 mile and 1 kilometer, 1 mile here and 1 kilometer here. And the next example, there are not too many left here. Hope you can bear with me. Here we have Vermont State House to Maine State House. That is as 1 mile, while Vermont State House to Connecticut Capitol is as 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers here. So let's measure now from Vermont, those two distances. First in miles to Maine State House. So off to Maine. And here we find the distance of 138.85. 138, we can say 138.84. no, 0.85, let's say that. And if we double that, we get 277.7. 277.7. Let's measure in kilometers now to Connecticut state capital from Vermont, where we should find 277.7 kilometers here. And here's Connecticut state capital. And you can see that within the footprints here, we have the numbers 277.7 kilometers, which is half the numbers we had in miles in the other distance. So the ratio, again, between these two distances is as 1 mile here and 2 kilometers here. So again, again, the kilometer-mile ratio. Let me now add the final kilometer-mile ratio here. And that's these two distances. If I zoom out a little bit here. Rhode Island State House to Maine is as 1 kilometer, while this distance, Rhode Island State House to Pennsylvania State Capital, is as 1 mile. So let's measure from Rhode Island to those two. First to Maine in kilometers. So here we are at Rhode Island, and we measure the shortest distance we find in the footprints between these two. Rhode Island to Maine. And here we find the distance. Here is Maine State House again, of 305.45 in kilometers here. You see it here in the measure too. 305.45 kilometers. Let's shift to miles and measure the other distance from Rhode Island to Pennsylvania State Capital, where we should find 305.45 miles now. And this is the longest distance we now find within the footprints of these buildings. So let's measure. Rhode Island to Pennsylvania State Capital. So here we have Pennsylvania State Capital, and 305.45 miles is what we find here. The same numbers we just had in kilometers. You see it here. So that means then in the final example we again had the ratio of 1 mile and 1 kilometers between these two distances. 1 kilometer here and 1 mile here. So that was a good number of examples of how the kilometer-mile ratio ordered the distances, or the locations you can say, of these capital buildings here in and around New England. And to show you that it's not only this ratio that provides the order here, I'll add two examples of the meter-yard ratio providing the order, so that you see that the larger order, if you will, it consists of, well, all of these unit of measurement ratios. And but I have to start somewhere and single out a few of them. So let me show that now, the meter-yard ratio ordering distances. And here we have two distances between Massachusetts and New York state capitals, and Massachusetts to Vermont. And here the ratio is 1 yard here, Massachusetts to New York, and 1 meter here, Massachusetts to Vermont. And I have one more example after this, but let's measure this first. Massachusetts to New York in yards first. So Massachusetts State House here to New York. And here in yards, we find the distance to New York State Capital here of 244. Let's say 244.72 here. 244.72. Let's remember those numbers. Let's fly back and now measure in meters from Massachusetts to Vermont, where we will then find 244.72 here to Vermont from Massachusetts in meters instead. So here we are at Vermont and 244, Vermont State House here. 244.72 we have here in meters. 244.72. You can see it here. That means then that the ratio between those two is 1 meter and 1 yard here. That was that example. Let me add the final in this, probably not too long and boring video, hopefully. And that is New York State Capitol to Vermont and New York to Maine State House. And here the ratio is New York to Vermont, 1 meter, and New York to Maine, 2 yards. 2 yards and 1 meter here. So let's measure from New York to Vermont first. In meters. So here we are at New York State Capitol, and the meter distance is here. Here's the building. From within the footprints here, this end up to Vermont. And here we find a distance of, let's say, 202.58. 202.58 here. 202.58 in meters. If you double that, you get 405.16. 405.16. And that's what we find in yards in the second distance. So let's fly back to New York and measure that. New York to Maine State House. So here we are at New York again, and we'll measure from this end of the Capitol building here, up to Maine. And we are looking for 405.16, 405.16 in yards here. And we find it here if you look in the measure tool, 405.16 in yards here. Right here to Maine State House. So in this final example, we had again the meter-yard ratio ordering the two distances. First as 1 meter and then as 2 yards here. So those were all the examples I wanted to show here, how the unit of measurement ratios, in this case the kilometer-mile and the meter-yard ratio, orders the distances and orders the locations of all of these state capitals here and even up into Canada. And when you look, and hopefully I can show you more examples in videos here, how this is true for all of these capital buildings or government buildings here. This was the first sample. So if you watched this far, I congratulate you. Hope I didn't bore you to death, and thank you very much for watching, if you did so.